It was December of 1941. The United States entered into World War II, which had been raging in Europe since 1939, and the country went into overdrive to provide whatever was necessary for our military. Over the following years, shipyards around the country began constructing hundreds of ships for the U.S. Navy. These ships needed to survive and endure the risks of war, like enemy fire, and they were facing advanced incendiary bombs, which were more flammable and destructive weapons than cannonballs. The ships also needed to be fireproof to protect the service members and any weapons and cargo aboard from accidents that could occur. Fortunately for the military at the time, one particular ingredient was already well known for its durable fireproof qualities. Unfortunately, and lesser known by the masses, was that the war wasn't the only danger they faced. This ingredient was known to cause health problems. Of course, the ingredient was asbestos, and millions of Navy veterans were exposed to it. Let's take a look at asbestos and the U.S. Navy on this episode of Asbestos Rewind. Asbestos is a group of minerals with amazing qualities like being strong, lightweight, fireproof, and resistant to electricity, chemicals, and rust. It can also be mixed with other materials to fireproof and strengthen them. That's why for most of the 20th century, asbestos was used in buildings and products of all kinds, and one of the main places manufacturers used asbestos was on ships and submarines. Several thousand tons of asbestos, in fact. It was in the hulls and floor tiles covering electrical wiring, insulating propulsion equipment like industrial pumps, boilers, and turbines, inside the bulkheads in the cabins where sailors slept, and in the kitchens and mess halls where they ate. They also used asbestos to protect important navigation equipment. The U.S. government had specific regulations in place regarding what materials should be used to construct military ships. They're called military specifications, often called mil-specs. Beginning in 1939, the Navy mandated the use of asbestos products in new ships. This meant that resources needed to be dedicated to the war, so the production of commercial asbestos products, like fake snow for example, was placed on the back burner. Though it was a time of war, this rapid demand for production benefited the asbestos industry. Many companies used the war to craft patriotic advertisements for their products and further bolster sales. That's not the only thing the asbestos companies were up to at the time either. They had knowledge since the 1930s that asbestos exposure could lead to diseases like asbestosis and even cancer. It was first documented in a British medical journal in 1924. They just didn't share that knowledge with their employees or the public. In 1941, the head of the Division of Preventative Medicine of the Navy's Bureau of Medicine and Surgery, Commander Charles S. Stevenson, sent a memo to Admiral McIntyre, the Surgeon General of the U.S. Navy at the time. The memo was regarding reports of asbestosis and other health hazards coming from the Navy shipyards. When the truth inevitably came out around the late 1960s, many of the asbestos companies were sued for the injuries they caused by not disclosing the truth about the hazards of their products. When the public finally understood how dangerous asbestos was, this meant that the government and military also had to do something about the asbestos all over its ships and vessels. So in 1975, the Navy implemented a policy to remove and replace with non-asbestos materials any insulation that was damaged or had to be removed to accomplish necessary repairs. The policy was specific in that asbestos materials could only be replaced if a substitute product that was deemed acceptable by the Navy was available. This process took many years since the Navy had to wait for suitable replacement materials to become available, and because it takes time to perform asbestos abatement work on a ship. In some instances, asbestos materials had already been purchased prior to the policy being issued, meaning newly constructed ships were arriving for duty full of asbestos as late as 1978. In 1979, the Navy estimated it would cost $2 billion to plan a one-time asbestos removal for all of its ships. Clearly, that was an expense far too large for them to consider in 1979. Today, it's difficult to say whether there are still ships out there that still contain asbestos. The most honest answer is probably not, or not too many. The Navy eventually performed abatement work on most or all of the ships which used the hazardous ingredient in the first place. But the Navy reported in 1979 that an estimated 30 to 50% of asbestos insulation on ships would never be seen, touched, or manipulated during the useful life of the ship. The majority of ships built during that time frame have been decommissioned, which means they've been taken out of service. Usually when that happens, the ship is either scrapped, demolished, or sold, or sometimes donated to another country or a museum. Sometimes the ships can be towed to a storage facility, or sometimes they're even used as target practice. Navy service members and even shipyard workers were put at risk of developing asbestos-related illnesses from the materials involved in the construction of ships and vessels. Installing, repairing, and removing asbestos-containing materials like thermal insulation is dusty work that creates a lot of friable fibers. Friable means it's airborne. The risk to workers and service members was even greater depending on whether quality personal protective equipment and ventilation were available. Asbestos exposure has a long latency period, which means that after a person is exposed to asbestos, it takes at least 20 years and perhaps as many as 50 years before that person's symptoms show up. Fortunately, most veterans that were injured by asbestos in service can apply for disability benefits and compensation from special trusts set up to compensate asbestos victims. That's it for another segment of our asbestos revolution. Remember to like and subscribe if you haven't done so already, and if there's anything about asbestos that you're curious about or would like to see covered in the future, post your ideas and questions in the comments below. Thanks for watching Asbestos Rewind.